I'm Dr. Alicia Ruverall. I'm a writer, scholar, and lecturer, and I'm currently research associate at Creative Manchester, where I've been the academic lead on the Creative Industries Deep Dive Aspect project for Greater Manchester. I've taught creative writing at Manchester, Sheffield Hallam, and since 2019, the University of Salford. And my critical research focuses on contemporary fiction, women's experimental writing, and globalization. I've also done a great deal of partnership with institutions outside of universities for some 20 years on and off in the US and the UK. Lastly, I come from a family that worked intergenerationally in film and television in the US. So I've a great deal vested in seeing the creative and cultural industries thrive and survive. And I myself have worked in them, as Sam has as well.
So hi, I'm Dr. Sam Stockley Patel. My academic background, broadly speaking, is kind of cultural and creative industries related, with a kind of particular focus on the kind of geographic dynamics of those sectors. My current role is as a researcher on a project called XR Stories at the University of York, where I'm exploring kind of various aspects of the emergent VR, AR, and other kind of interactive and immersive media and technologies sectors, both in the UK and also globally. Outside of academic work, I've also run a small graphic design company for the last decade or so. So we know that social sciences, academics, and kind of organizations across the creative industries engage and partner in various ways for research purposes. And our Aspect project explores and kind of evidences some of the kind of opportunities and also the challenges of those partnerships. We sought to learn from both kind of academics and also from kind of creative sector professionals who had that kind of engagement and partnership experience in order to kind of better understand best practice for creative industries and academic research engagement.
The Creative Industries Deep Dive project sought to explore what constitutes best practice in partnerships between HEIs, that's higher education institutions, and CCIs, or the creative and cultural industries. What builds a strong and successful partnership, what that looks like, as well as the types of institutional support that there may be or may not currently be in place to support such partnerships, was a chief focus of our work.
Academics and kind of creative industries companies across the kind of Yorkshire region spoke about all sorts of issues, really, but three kind of key broad themes or ideas were most common. So the first relates to how the kind of potential for kind of meaningful and kind of useful engagement is impacted upon by the wider kind of structures of universities. So, for example, I found that engagement often takes place between companies and academics who kind of already know each other, who've been able to build kind of more personal relationships, often at things like industry events or at conferences, and oftentimes outside of what we might understand as kind of normal working hours. So this means that academics and also kind of creative sector professionals who have certain types of social capital are more likely to engage, and also individuals with less kind of demanding lecturing responsibilities or with less caring responsibilities, for instance, are also more likely to engage. The second key theme relates to how these partnerships kind of communicate and share ideas and share knowledge. So, for example, creative industries companies have very often voiced kind of concerns about the kind of complexity of academic writing and sometimes speaking conventions, and kind of how inaccessible research findings can often be for kind of non-academic audiences. So whilst kind of some academics were quite aware of that issue and were keen to kind of find potentially different ways of kind of communicating findings, issues like the demands on their time and the ways in which certain publications are favored by their kind of institutions limited to a great extent their ability to kind of do any additional or different types of knowledge transfer. And thirdly, I was able to start to understand how academics and their research add value to creative industries partners. So firstly, through kind of evidence gathering type research. So for instance, gathering and evaluating useful data for the kind of creative industries company that they might need for kind of reporting or fundraising purposes, but also in less kind of explicit or obvious ways through kind of critical, creative and entrepreneurial thinking, where the gains might be kind of less immediately tangible, but instead kind of longer term and more strategic. And likewise, I also found evidence of some of the ways in which sector engagement adds value to academic careers, enhancing job prospects and improving kind of career progression.
A number of my findings quite paralleled Sam's in his region as well. Firstly, in terms of establishing partnerships, partnerships did generally evolve out of existing professional networks, with few HEI researchers looking to university BE teams to undertake their partnerships. That was a common theme. Key components of success included management of expectations with regard to pace, timing, delivery, outcomes, and equitable budgets. All of those points came up across many interviews. In terms of partnership and engagement infrastructure, BE teams broker partnerships and offer related support, including smaller pots of funding. This wasn't always known, but this is in fact the case. Partnerships were often stymied, though, by bureaucracies in universities, or it might be stymied by heavy workloads. Teaching and marking were frequently referenced. Precarious contracts as a result of inadequate staffing or delays in hiring sometimes proved problematic in terms of infrastructure support. With regard to language and outputs, language and terminology often prove divisive between CCI and HEI partners, and BE officers often serve as translators, which can ameliorate those differences. Intercultural communication was deemed a critical area for exploration and for further training as part of navigating the fourth industrial or digital revolution. Value added, as Sam noted, was an essential component of partnerships for both HEIs and CCIs, and an important motivator for collaboration. And training into partnership, a term that I've kind of come up with through the process of this project, as undergraduates and graduate students move into placements and internships, collaborative PhDs, all of these proved valuable, really valuable for both sides. One of the things I really didn't expect, but that made complete sense, is this idea that hybrids have a particular angle into, and maybe even a leg up when it comes to partnerships. And by that, I mean a poet who's also an academic, or someone on the BE team who either did a PhD or studied toward a PhD, individuals who were accustomed to reaching kind of across different groups and demographics even, and cultural settings. And those individuals often, I think, had a different level of understanding about trying to cross what I would call kind of a cultural gap between the HEIs and the CCIs.
So in addition to that, I would actually agree. I found the same thing. And I found that the experience of working in the sector and the benefits that brings in terms of an academic's personal networks really affected their capacity for kind of useful and kind of impactful engagement in a kind of academic role. And that actually appeared to shape university employment practices too, with the kind of the value that those professional networks bring being recognized by faculties and by schools when employing someone with kind of industry experience. So rather interestingly, and counter to what we expected, we didn't really find, or I certainly didn't find, any kind of particular regional disparities in terms of how engagement actually happened. That said, we did find some evidence of kind of academic departments or kind of university bodies that were kind of particularly good at kind of creative sector engagement. And so it might be that that you might find kind of hotspots of engagement activity in those areas that's particularly useful. But we don't necessarily have a kind of Yorkshire model of engagement as opposed or related to a different Greater Manchester model.
Between these two regions, I don't believe we found regional disparities. Sam and I found roughly, I think, the same sorts of concerns about differences, pace, timing, institutional support budget inequities, et cetera, in partnerships. Now, certainly there were economic disparities. I think it's widely understood between North and South, and this was sometimes referenced in the interviews. But generally speaking, the issues that faced Yorkshire informants paralleled what I found in Greater Manchester.
In terms of the pandemic, I think somewhat surprisingly, in the interviews that I did in the Yorkshire region, it didn't really come up, which makes no sense considering the time frame that I was doing the interviews. But maybe that's because I kind of didn't ask the questions specifically, and because it wasn't kind of explicitly related to the questions that I did ask in the conversations that we had, or maybe because somehow in the Yorkshire region, COVID didn't affect or impact kind of engagement activity, which seems extremely unlikely. The only mention of COVID really was when a creative industries professional working in the film and TV sectors was kind of reflecting about the differences between kind of commissioning research with an academic as opposed to commissioning research with a consultancy, where they said that for kind of time sensitive and kind of more emergent issues, like understanding the impact of the pandemic, for instance, that a consultancy is preferable for reasons of kind of logistics and speed.
So I suppose I did probe our interviewees, perhaps a bit more than Sam did, about the impact of COVID, if only because I'd been interviewing on the NHS at 70 project about the effects of COVID on health and social situations and circumstances for individuals across Greater Manchester. So I was quite keen about COVID and what was going on with it and its impact, the pandemic on the creative industries. So much of that discussion focused on how CCIs responded most immediately to the crisis, if you want to call it that, or to the pandemic. Not just the move to online delivery, but the effort to build partnerships between CCIs or mutually support one another as local organizations were seeking to survive. Now, some reported positive developments, expanded audiences, etc., but informants also spoke about workers, particularly freelancers, leaving the sector and the effects of COVID on diversity. Specifically, where small gains had been made, but the fear was that the industry would reset in a worse place in this regard on the other side of the pandemic. Now, in terms of partnership, because Sam and I have talked about this, some things have to do with the industry broadly, but we're really about the partnerships here. Some partnerships carried on, certainly while some organizations felt more keenly issues of capacity um, that led to greater caution about partnerships. That is what I found personally in my own work, is that in some instances, institutions didn't have the bandwidth to engage. The cumulative effects of austerity, Brexit, and COVID had combined effects, I think, that proved costly.
I mean, in addition to what Alicia said, actually, there's the way in which creative industries organizations have been able to kind of respond to the pandemic and the various effects that it's had, kind of massively links to their overall capacity and resource to kind of absorb those kinds of challenges. And so, even though this wasn't necessarily borne out in the research, I would hypothesize that very simply speaking, bigger organizations were better able to carry on with their kind of engagement and partnership activity as compared to smaller organizations.
I think Sam's absolutely right that larger organization had a different kind. I interviewed someone with 250 employees, and they had a very different kind of capacity to respond in the face of COVID in terms of partnerships versus these organizations where there are 5 to 6 maximum employees. So I think that's where size makes a fantastic difference. And certainly one of our informants talked about losing an entire year's box office income. So, you know, clearly the industries were hugely affected. I was surprised when people talked about the benefits, and they often did so rather uncomfortably because they knew the losses of COVID were so huge in so many ways.
So there are numerous ways really in which kind of engaging with the sectors, with the creative industries adds value to kind of academic careers and kind of benefits research impact. I think perhaps most straightforwardly, and this was certainly the most common reflection in this regard, is that kind of engagement beyond the academy was deemed valuable by kind of social sciences researchers because it often led to opportunities for research publication. So in terms of ref and so on, it's obviously important that academics are publishing research and kind of engaging with companies is one way in which to kind of collect novel data and to write articles. I think, you know, in that respect, engaging with creative industries organizations is useful for improving CVs and advancing academic careers. and so on. I would say, relatedly, in addition to making kind of CVs better, academics also suggested that their kind of personal profiles, research profiles, were enhanced through business engagement activities. And the kind of the value of that profile raising was kind of considered broadly useful in the kind of competitive academic job and funding market, and therefore useful for future potential impact. There's also a wider and maybe less explicit importance of engagement beyond kind of obvious impact measurements or metrics too, and that's that academics need to understand the areas that they research, of course, and need to know what's happening in their respective fields. And so engagement with the sectors, even where there might not be a specific journal output or reputable output in mind, is really important, just in terms of academics being in touch with the sectors and kind of understanding what's happening. As a kind of university sector, I think we need to find ways to value engagement beyond the academy for engagement's sake, almost, as a kind of key part of an academic's work in terms of understanding and being experts about a respective field. And that remains true even when a specific kind of referable output isn't part of the picture for any given partnership or business engagement project. And finally, I'd say that a real issue in terms of real world impact, by which I mean, for instance, maybe changing policy or organizational culture and things like that, is that kind of work takes time, it takes resource, and it takes funding. So there are certainly examples of how academics do those kinds of things for sure in Yorkshire and beyond, but those are often limited by some of the kind of wider structural issues which negatively impact upon the extent to which academics can kind of work intensively with a partner over a kind of protracted period. And it's true to say that those challenges in terms of time and funding and follow-on funding for impact are kind of particularly borne out by academics who are kind of already at a disadvantage. So for example, an earlier career academic on a short-term contract will struggle to make significant impact as compared to others who are less precariously employed.
Yes, I would say I'd agree with Sam's commentary here quite a bit, in that academics sometimes have articles that emerge from these projects. You might even say often in certain circumstances, but that wasn't the exclusive output that they pointed to. Informants also spoke about other outcomes such as conferences and symposia, as well as programmatic outcomes, documentaries, websites, podcasts, and exhibitions. HEI-CCI collaborations often engaged members of the public, so there's impact work involved here too, of course, valuable for the ref. Academics spoke about policy, about the longer term engagement that can more effectively support that. And in fact, I would say that those longer term partnerships are the ones that were most frequently cited as being the most valuable. I interviewed top level faculty across 3 institutions locally, Manchester Metropolitan, and Salford, and their research had only grown as a result of this work.
Given the right time and resource, there are all sorts of ways that engagement between academics and kind of creative industries companies can be kind of impactful for those kind of sector partners. So perhaps most straightforwardly, for example, academic research can provide organizations with evidence and with data, which is really useful in a wide variety of kind of tangible ways. So for example, collecting and evaluating audience data can be a key part of an organization's reporting and can really shape their applications for further funding and support. And therefore it's kind of crucial to their future work and their kind of organizational sustainability and so on. And I think relatedly, kind of similar types of evidence gathering can shape organizational policy and organizational culture. So for example, an academic that I interviewed spoke about collecting audience diversity data and being able to show a kind of relative lack of audience diversity and therefore being able to create a kind of evidence-led foundation for kind of organizational change across the kind of creative sector company in terms of outreach and marketing and scheduling and so on. Beyond these types of kind of readily applicable insights, academics also create impact by offering more kind of entrepreneurial ideas with longer term trajectories. So for example, one cultural organization spoke about how an academic was able to consult on issues relating to kind of problematic representations of race in some work that they were doing. And in this instance, not only did the kind of academics insight impact the work and encourage change, but they were also able to kind of catalyze more strategic and kind of innovative thinking within the cultural organization about potential opportunities for reaching new and more diverse audiences in future.
Very good point, Sam. Yes, I found in Manchester as well that CCI professionals were very vocal about the value they received from their HEA partnerships and invariably wanted more, much more involvement with local HEI institutions. In some instances, CCIs didn't know the best points of entry, though, or what the HI priorities were that they might meet or dovetail with. So this is something HEIs need to be aware of, and perhaps we need to do a better job of this. That said, CCIs found that the knowledge and insights from HEI researchers were invaluable, bringing academic expertise to their outputs, heritage displays, community activism projects, as well as bringing support on funding bids. Academics often helped, not just on the funding bids, but they could also bring a sector overview. And at least one informant commented on the value of that. Another informant spoke about HEI perspectives as shaping their own, and therefore their institutions as well. But their hope was also to shape the HEI's understandings, the understandings of the academics. So the idea of this as being very reciprocal, in fact. And I think that that's quite an important point in terms of the value of these exchanges and these partnerships. So in terms of what needs to be in place for successful research engagement, I'd say trust, a strong working relationship, flexibility in terms of how the partnership evolves over time, with a recognition that there are pressures on both sides. Ethical practice, this includes involving partners in budgetary matters and a continuing recognition of the importance of diversity, not just in terms of numbers, but also leadership on these projects. Publications and career advancement can be a feature of these partnerships, but most academics did not define these as the essential outcomes of success. Often it was a bit more broad. Sometimes it was continuing dialogue, sometimes a partnership in which you wanted to do a follow-on project was an example of success in their book. Developing a partnership over a long period of time offers different kinds of benefits. So growth in insight and greater understandings, a more nuanced understanding of the areas of research, as well as the capacity to engage with policymakers, all of which require time. Funding, I'd say, remains vital. HEI researchers or CCI professionals who themselves were hybrid, I think I noted this earlier, a poet who is also an academic, or a former PGR turned BE professional, were often better placed to successfully develop collaborations because they did have that capacity to reach across difference and use language that was inclusive and engaging, thus building a stronger partnership.
Academics need time really for effective engagement, and impactful partnership work often happens over the course of sort of months and years rather than over weeks and months, and that reality needs to be reflected in kind of employment contracts and workloads and so on within and across universities. I think related to that, we need kind of further recognition in terms of the importance of network building and how, where, and why that happens. And so allowing academics to engage with the kind of creative industries or with the sectors that they research, both kind of formally as well as informally, in recognition that networking and relationship building is potentially really valuable for future engagement work, I think is a really important thing. And then I'd say finally on this, the issues of organizational scale, by which I mean the creative industries organization, are really important here. So academics across Yorkshire and Humber universities that I interviewed spoke a lot about how kind of engagement infrastructure within universities, so for instance, knowledge transfer teams or partnership and engagement teams, and the kind of administrative and managerial skills and capacities that they bring were so often crucial when working with kind of larger cultural sector organizations over longer periods of time. But that wasn't necessarily the case if an individual academic was working with a kind of creative industries SME or freelancer. Something else, I think Alicia kind of reflected on this too, but to expand on the importance of the notion of trust between the researcher and the creative industries organization. So oftentimes academics are researching things which are kind of sensitive or complex. It might be about, I don't know, disability access or workforce diversity and so on. And in order to do so meaningfully, academics really need to understand quite intimately the company they're working with, and the opposite is also true. And so having time to really build those relationships and kind of manifest that trust is absolutely vital. I had kind of cultural industries workers talking about how strange it sometimes is to have an academic sitting in the corner of a room and taking notes about what you're doing when you don't know them very well. And so I think recognizing that getting to know the company better is often really important, especially where the kind of topic of research is more complex or sensitive.
Picking up on Sam's commentary about time, and particularly his comment about, not knowing a researcher who might be sitting in the corner all that well. One of the points that came up with several faculty is the need for that proper release time, actually, from whether it's the teaching or the marking, to be truly available to build that kind of partnership. Because, if we're going to build trust, as Sam was saying, it takes time. And I think perhaps related to that, one informant noted that they sometimes thought that maybe we're rewarded in academia through administrative posts, not necessarily through kind of innovative engagement or really creative collaborations and breaking into different kinds of much more engaging, in a way, kind of academic risk taking, if you will, creative academic risk taking. So I think that might be something for us to reflect on. What are our markers here in academia, and how might we shift those to better support academics in making that kind of commitment? Because it is a commitment to build those kinds of partnerships and spend that kind of time.
In terms of what next, for me, it would be really interesting to get a sense of which types of kind of engagement bodies within universities, which might be kind of certain research institutes or kind of other types of partnership focused teams, are particularly successful at kind of brokering and making useful these kinds of engagement activities with the creative industries, and why it is that they're particularly useful and successful. I think that a kind of a wider study, in particular beyond our regions, would be really fruitful in that respect. And additionally, I'd also really like to explore how we might start to better value and make space for other kinds of knowledge transfer and communication, beyond niche academic journals. So whether that's making use of video or social media or events or whatever else it might be, I think there's kind of significant scope for academics to be more creative and potentially more impactful too, in terms of the ways in which we share what we learn. And further study to explore other types of dissemination which have been useful and valuable, in particular kind of for the creative sector companies that we work with, would I think be a really important and good thing. And I think what's interesting about this in terms of working with the cultural and creative industries is that those sectors are in many ways experts at communicating ideas and getting people excited about them and so on. And so I think perhaps there's a great potential for learning on the part of universities and researchers too, in that regard.
I'd say our hope with this next phase of research would be, firstly, to involve another regional partner in the mix so that we can determine the role of region on a more granular level, perhaps. And as well as implementation of what we learned. By this, I mean putting supportive partnerships into action, as well as training into partnership. I call it the process on the university level, at least, of providing students with a toolkit of sorts so that they are trained to work in CCIs. But implementation might also mean urging universities to look closely at how they might support such ongoing partnerships. For instance, as I've noted, we found that collaborative and especially cross-disciplinary work was not especially well funded. Finding ways for BE teams to liaise more directly with faculty so that they can be better utilized. But our next phase will likely be getting our findings out further still, such as conferences and articles. And lastly, coming back to this geography point, it may be worthwhile to examine in future how geography plays into CCI HEI partnerships locally as part of current place-based research in the creative industries. And we might be able to hone that pursue that a bit further. That was something that came up in conversation as Sam and I were working on our joint report.
It'll be interesting to explore whether or not the kind of London and Southeast bias in terms of the creative industries and where they are is reflected in a similar bias in terms of where academic and creative industries engagement is. That might be true. And the other thing is that we've both looked at engagement between the stakeholders in relatively urbanized contexts. We've looked at universities in big cities where there's obviously more kind of creative industries activity. So it'd be interesting to find perhaps a more rural university and to see if they're also engaging in similar ways and there are kind of similar dynamics born out in those partnerships too.